Welcome to session 11. There's a poetry to this course that is reoccurring for those who witness it. The very first session was on spiritualism. The very last session we did, session 10, was on the witch trials and the burning times. With these two considered, this time we're focusing on the New Age, and both of the previously mentioned topics are relevant to this. What is the New Age? What does that mean? How can we understand it? And also, how does it spell out for what the future is going to look like? Now, before I get started, I also want to say something about the course in general, which is that this course is informative. It aims to not bludgeon any beliefs. It aims to not push anything. It just aims to allow people the freedom to investigate. So with that said, this topic of the New Age carries that theme in a way. Now, the mention of the burning times and the subsequent fall of the power of Christianity is the beginning of the New Age talk. The decline of Christianity's power over the people left a vacuum to be settled. As science began to assert itself, the common culture changed and needed new answers to questions that were left. So in lieu of Christianity's institutional fall, what were the results? So we're going to talk about many topics here. So we're not sticking to one thing, but we do have to start with spiritualism. We start with spiritualism because it goes back to the 1840s. I'm not going to talk about this a lot because if you're truly interested in this topic, then you can refer to the first session on the YouTube channel. The brief history is that the Fox sisters were hearing rappings at their chamber doors, so to speak, and believed this to be an apparition attempting to communicate with them. This story gained sensationalism over time, and throughout the 1840s to the 1920s, this was a part of not only the common culture, but also of the scientific brigade. This was something very integral to the culture that was happening at that time. This is something that starts the New Age in a way that it's bringing up conversations that have long been left on the shelf. For instance, this aspect of channeling or this aspect of speaking with the dead is something that can be traced all the way back to early shamanism and modern day animism. So this isn't something new. This isn't New Age per se, but it is the beginning of the New Age per se. So as it stands today, spiritualists are still around. It's not what it was before, but there have been those who have maintained. There is no religiosity in spiritualism. And what I mean by that is there's no set beliefs. There are those who classify themselves as New Age. There are those who classify themselves as Neopagan, which we'll get to. And then there are those who classify themselves as Christian spiritualists. This is something of more of a philosophy, an approach to life, than it is a religion, as we'll be seeing as a characteristic of a lot of the New Age. So the elephant in the room on this topic of the New Age is Theosophy. It's the big one, and I likely at some point will give an entire talk dedicated to this topic, but it starts with Madame Blavatsky, and she has a whole story of her own. But what's relevant is when she arrived in America and was reactionary to the spiritualist movement that was happening in the 1870s. She found distinctions that she didn't agree with when it came to the spiritualists. So through a series of events and through meeting other characters, they set forth the following principles of Theosophy, and these are rather poetic for the greater conversation that we're going to be talking about. So these are the principles. 1. To form a nucleus dedicated towards the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, or sex. So, very secular, very humanitarian, and still topical to this day, right? 2. To encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. Now, comparative religion is a big one, and that is relatively new for history, which we'll talk more about that. And 3, and this is where it gets exotic and really gets the woo-woo end of how people think about theosophy. To investigate the unexplained laws of natures and the powers latent in man. This would later be called parapsychology, the study of aspects like clairvoyance, telepathy, and astral projection, which we'll get to later. The term theosophy is way older than Madame Blavatsky. It goes all the way back to Plato. It means universal striving, or the spiritual knowledge existing in all cultures. The way they said it, it is the root and trunk of the tree of which all religions are branches. Each religion contains a portion of truth. However, theosophy more often than not would use Buddhism and Hinduism heavily. And nature does not operate by chance. Belief, a strong belief in an immortal higher self beyond the body. To get back to the etymology of theosophy, it just meant God's wisdom. Theo, Sophie, God, Theo, Sophie, Sophia, wisdom, or divine wisdom. The word can be found in the Manichaeans. They can be found in Iranian culture. You can find it in the Middle Ages among the Bogomils in Bulgaria and the Byzantine Empire. You can find it in the Cathars. No mistake here that we're getting some Gnosticism references. You could find it in the Rosicrucians, and of course, you can find it in Freemasonry, which is still alive. Now, the belief that God, this is the difference too, the difference in Christianity at least, that the New Age is going to take up through theosophy. The belief that God is utterly transcendent and impersonable. The creation is the product of spiritual emanations from God, and that human beings are trapped in the material world through a series of mechanisms, and they desire to return to their spiritual home. Again, no mistake, this sounds a lot like Gnosticism. So to give a little bit more of the history instead of the ideology here, theosophy moved itself to India in 1878. They settled in Ardiyar in India. They branched societies out in India and major cities in Europe and North America. The big one was in London. It was the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society, which was established in 1888. This is where the occultism really falls into play, not to mention Madame Blavatsky's own publications, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. After Madame Blavatsky died, the society dwindled, and then it had a resurgence with a new leader, Krishnamurti. And Krishnamurti toured in the 1920s. This kind of was, as spiritualism was going down, theosophy was on the rise. However, in 1929, Krishnamurti resigned, and then the society dissolved. However, it's also still alive to this day, but in a very limited form. A lot of corrupted groups would take this in very different directions. Now, something that I have to get out of the way too is this interest in the New Age in regards to the term astral projection. This seems new, but again, it's not. You'll find this in Hermeticism, you'll find this in Neoplatonism, You'll find it among the Rosicrucians. The idea is that the astral body is an intermediary body of light, essentially, linking your soul and physical body. Now, this sounds a little wooey, but like I've mentioned before, there were many initiatives to prove this, not just among the how do you call them? The Theosophical Society, but also among the spiritualists. One of the most notable proofs of this is Kirlian photography. There's a lot of talk in the modern day of aura, and this is something that plays into the talk of the astral body. If you're going straight into multidimensional humanism, then there are talks of many different bodies, how you are participatory as a human being on many other planes other than just simply your physical body. For instance, here's a very rational example. If we're having a conversation, we're not only participating in that conversation physically, but we're also making that conversation happen abstractly. We are participating in a different realm of things, and there are other things happening. We don't see this realm, but we intuit this realm. This would be an idea of having another body per se. So it's not as wooey as some might think, and they do take it to wooey proportions, mind you. This is one of the central criticisms that Christianity has against the New Age, is that, for instance, those who travel astral projection-wise into the astral planes and whatnot are infiltrated by demons, of course, right? Not angels, but just demons. But if we're going to be a little nerdy about this, then we do find references to astral projection, or at least hinting towards astral projection in the Bible proper. For instance, in 2 Corinthians 12:2, it says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in a body I do not know, or whether out of body I do not know, God knows such a one was caught up to the 3rd heaven. So was he there? Was he astral projecting? Strange reference. And another one, Ecclesiastes 12:6, before the silver cord is snapped. Now, this reference right here, I have to back up. The silver cord is something that is mentioned, or the golden cord, or just the cord, is something mentioned in astral projection work. It is the thing that links you to your body. So no matter where you go, it's your way of always returning back. Similarly, in dreams, they would say that you have this cord that's still attached to you that will always return you back to the body no matter how far out in dreamland you travel. So that's how to dissect this reference. Before the silver cord is snapped, and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern. So very strange kind of esoteric references here. Not sure how to exactly take out of it. So there is some seemingly subtle proof here of early Christianity, or the writers of the different texts in the Bible, knowing of astral projection in the ancient world. You find this idea in Egypt, you find it in China, you find it in Japan, you find it in Hinduism, you find it in the Inuit tribes, and you find it in the Amazon tribes. Now, this isn't shocking because, again, this bleeds back all the way to shamanism. The shamanistic journey, or the shamanic journey, is all about this act of transposing yourself into a different body, negotiating or speaking with or hearing the wisdoms of the spirits, so that you can report back different ways of healing, or different ways of understanding the world, or different ways of harvesting the plants, where to be, and so forth. This predates religion accordingly. So it's an old conversation. Again, this is a talk that could take an hour of itself, so I'm going to end here. But this topic of astral projection was heavily pushed by Theosophy, and has blended itself into the New Age in all sorts of ways. It's not just necessarily Theosophy, because now you have this whole study which is called out-of-body experiences, or OBEs. This is something that has been, yet again, I want to mention, the most heavily criticized aspect of the New Age by Christianity being that they believe it is a means to open oneself up to demonic possession. Now, something I want to note right here, and I hope I don't take too much time because we got a lot to go over, is that Christianity, if you search online and you just look up the New Age, you just pop it in the YouTube or whatever, you know, you'll find a absolute storm of all of these videos demonizing the New Age, and of all these apparent converts that swear that they become possessed, and they have all these stories of these very paranormal, demonic experiences from these people that then, of course, as you'd expect, saw Christ, and Christ saved them from all of this. So this is why I wanted to bring up this talk after the witch burning talk, because this is the modern day example of the power structure of Christianity forcing its exclusiveness. It needs a new enemy, and this is the new enemy of the church. It is the New Age, and that's a whole nother thing to dissect. So let's move on for now. Another reason why it would be contentious is that Neognosticism is a big part of the New Age movement. Now, there's a whole talk I've done on Gnosticism, so if you want to learn more on this, just go back into the channel and you'll find it. However, for this talk and the relevancy of our topic, Neo-Gnosticism isn't a religion of itself, it's a belief system. This belief system was somehow known by the Theosophical Society and by Carl Jung before many of these Gnostic books were literally dug up out of the ground. It was the Nag Hammadi Library which brought us these texts in the 50s, and then some more that were dug up in the 80s. However, this oral tradition has been passed on since it was basically genocided out of existence by the early church. Anyhow, this idea of Neo-Gnosticism has integrated itself with the New Age movement, and it takes another name that is called cosmic humanism. So, numerous people have Gnostic beliefs, but they don't know that it's Gnostic. So it's something that's that transient. It's really, the boundaries are very hard to discern. So in order to help establish these boundaries, I will give some of the some of the innate characteristics of what Gnosticism means. Gnosticism believes that the world is imperfect. Numerous religions sustain this idea. Buddhism is a great example, that it's filled with suffering and that creation is flawed in some way. It is not imperfect because of us. That's the distinction here in why it's contentious with Christianity. Christianity blames us for the sin, and Gnosticism was another growth of early Christianity that didn't believe this, that we are not at fault in this. The Gnostic God is an ultimate figure that is impersonal, right? Sounds like Theosophy here. Created the whole universe from himself, not from nothing, but from himself. Himself, herself, hermaphroditic. Everything around us is a part of God. And now you might think that Gnosticism is monotheistic. However, there are a series of archons or deities or intermediaries that run the functions of the universe. This very important aspect to Gnosticism too, and mind you, all of this is relevant to the New Age movement, so this is something that we'll digest later. But another very important belief is this idea of the divine spark, that every person is a light, that our life is a series of tasks for us to mature enough to embody that light. This is where you get the gnosis, or the awakening, of realizing that the world and materiality is cursed, so thus exemplifying your personal spirit. This is why more often than not, ancient Gnostics were ascetics, you know, and starving themselves, self-discipline and celibacy. That we as a whole people, everybody, so here's a difference too, belong in our spiritual home, and that we will all return to that spiritual home eventually. Gnosis is salvation. That's a big idea. Again, everybody gets this salvation. We are numerous messengers of the light, and once we all shine it bright enough collectively, it will transmute the rules and the very fabric of reality itself. And most importantly, this is why Gnosticism isn't a religion. It's because Gnosticism doesn't have rules. The ancient Gnostics had many different ways of approaching this philosophy. They don't believe a person needs rules for salvation. It comes from within. It's an individual practice. So this is a classic case of the difference between religion and spirituality. Religion is for the masses and spirituality is for the individual, right? So this is where Gnosticism's coming from. You do have certain attitudes that it encourages, but it's not a hard rule. For instance, non-attachment, respect for the freedom of others, but again, not rules. Every person should have their own practice and be left alone to practice as they want to. Big no-no for organized religion here. And lastly, the destiny of humankind. Each person on earth has a fate. They have to find the gnosis. Otherwise, they will be trapped here. So it kind of has a similar sense of that reincarnation story as Hinduism or Buddhism. And this is because of something that you can look into if you want. The reference is Oriental Hermeticism. The idea that there was a lot more knowledge of the Eastern ideologies in the Western world than we previously assumed. So either come back for a few more rounds or reach the gnosis and go home. That's the idea. Carl Jung wrote extensively on the themes. However, he knew how taboo it was in his time, so he did it in a very subtle way. You can find it most blatantly in his Septem Sermons ad Mortos, or the translated as the Seven Sermons of the Dead. Gnosticism inspired him and inspired the Theosophical movement. So this is something I want to mention right now, two things. When we say New Age, it is classified as the New Age because of the reference to the age of Aquarius. This is something that we talked about in the astrotheology talk. So that's why it's called New Age. However, as we're going to see, most of what is considered the New Age is actually from the Old Age. So it's more about, since the belief structure was blown up, that we would have a sort of renaissance to dig into the past and to find what we had dropped along the way to serve a better program for humanity going forward. Now, Gnosticism has been taken to a very strange degree, tying it to extraterrestrials, and that the archons and the demiurge are actual extraterrestrials. And this is because of ufology, which is the next topic. This is something completely new and does bleed into the New Age as well. It's like, oh, Connor, back up a bit. Don't go crazy about aliens. But it is relevant to the changing psychology of humanity as a whole. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. And again, just like the rest of this, ufology warrants at least an hour-long conversation by itself. But just for us kind of covering how it affects our topic, we can say it starts with the Foo Fighters, as they were called, reported by Allied air pilots in World War II. We could say the Battle of Los Angeles. If you don't know what that is, look it up. This happened in late February 24th or to early February 25th in 1942. A big one that really brought UFOs into the attention is actually a UFO reporting on top of Mount Rainier. It's called the Arnold sighting. This happened in June 24th of 1947. And at the same time, the summer of 1947, that's when what everybody knows about, Roswell, New Mexico happened. So this is a phenomena. This was not some isolated event. Reports of ghost flyers, as they were called, can be traced back to the 30s in Europe and North America, and many of these sightings happened in Scandinavia in 1946. So the media hype of the UFO craze came throughout the 40s and 50s, beginning with the Arnold sighting on top of Mount Rainier. The actual term UFO was coined in 1951. The general story is that the military began to investigate this while it was going through the Cold War and Korean War, believing that this technology was actually an unknown technology operated by the Soviet Union, of course. So later on, as they investigate, the military in 1952 claims that UFOs pose no threat to national security. Bring it down, right? Play it down. Captain Salas is one of these people who was at the Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, who witnessed a very large saucer shutting down nuclear missile warheads. Again, do you want to believe this or do you not? This has as history is reporting it. This was in 1967. And in 1969, Project Blue Book, which was the investigations of UFOs by the government, was officially disbanded, right? Claiming that no more investigation was warranted. And likewise, many governments throughout the world would also cease their investigations, with few exceptions. France still continues to this day, and I believe Canada still takes in the reports. Interesting little fun fact, I think this is true, I've heard this. Washington State in the States has the most UFO sightings reported by a large margin in comparison to the rest of the continental United States. So here's an interesting reference for those that want to dig too. Once the Soviet Union was dissolved, all of their classified files were no longer being enforced in their secrecy. So a lot of people inherited this information, and some people were so ballsy enough to publish them, and these were suppressed throughout the world. This is a true story. One of the most controversial of these released classified files was a whole catalog describing all of the extraterrestrial species that had been encountered by the government. And this is where we get the common culture understanding of certain aliens. And of course, people think of the Greys, but from this we get the Pleiadians and the Draconians. I am not going to go over that right now. But we have crop circles, we have cow mutilations. People have posed a lot of really good questions about flukes of crop circles, but cow mutilations is something that is still unexplained to this day. I've got my own theories about that one, but I'm trying to rush through right now. The Majestic 12 Initiative is a very well perpetuated conspiracy theory. And the idea is that this is, but the official story is that the government didn't believe that all this information would cause a mass hysteria. And in that way, all reportings would be classified and everything would be doled out and explained away in flukes. So there's a lot to dig into that might be happening under the surface here. But the belief and the appearance of UFOs heralding a kind of occult truth and being a sign of a transition into the New Age is where ufology and the New Age kind of blend together. Again, ufology blends with Gnosticism. Ufology would blend into different New Age kind of cults that would go about. there are many ways that this sudden interest in UFOs has translated into the changing ideas of the New Age. Okay, done talking about aliens. I get to switch topics a little bit here and talk about Neopaganism. So again, great example of the old world reoccurring. So you can call it Romuva, or you can call it Hellenism, or you can call it heathenry, or you can call it Adonism, or Druidry, or goddess movement, or discordantism, or radical fairies, or Thelema, or the most famous of them, Wicca. Thelema started with Aleister Crowley in the early 1900s. That is probably one of the most exotic of all the New Age kind of movements. That's the one that was most sensationalized and criticized for its kind of ceremonies and so forth. Simultaneously, Wicca's beginning was in the early 1900s, and it's not an accident here. Well, okay, two things. The difference in neo-paganism now versus how paganism was in the past, not a big difference, but just an extra flavor, is that it's heavily revolving, or a big theme of it is around nature centricism and goddess worship. So it's no accident that it's that neo-paganism is coming back when it did, because you have the Industrial Revolution, which is plummeting, exploiting, and just toxifying the land. But you also have this age-old patriarchy that is finally starting to dwindle. So neo-paganism would be that yin to that yang. It would operate under the duality of fighting back against the forces that have kind of ruled over the era. So in this way, all the more power to the neo-pagans. We need more people with that type of mentality if we truly want to preserve the natural state of things. Now, the more philosophical end that plays into the New Age of neo-paganism is the animistic aspects of pagan theology. That is, that all things have a soul. Everything has a soul. Not just humans, but all organic life, and what might be perceived as non-organic life. That mountains and rivers and trees and all animals have their own souls. And as a result, pagans believe that the essence of spirituality is timeless, that we are timeless, and that the age of specific religious movements is a sort of atrocity. It's all about this belief of shamanism, animism, of spirit in all things. Okay, a big different flavor now too in neo-paganism is that it's geared towards facilitating altered spaces of awareness, or altered states of mind, or shifting mindsets, or dissolving the boundaries of our conceptions. These altered states most often are brought on by ceremonies that include drumming, visualization, chanting, dancing, singing, meditation. These are all the natural ways of inducing altered states of consciousness, of which improve the general psyche of humanity and affect or heal the collective consciousness. So I'd be remiss to not mention the sacred medicine or psychedelic resurgence that is also tied to neo-paganism. So in this way, it transitions me into talking about the 60s. So I'm going to jump off this for a bit and talk about 60s from the 60s from the perspective of psychedelics. So in 1938, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann synthesizes LSD. You say it's discovered, but what I didn't mention in the witch topic is that the church knew about ergot of rye, and they used it to poison water supplies in order to convince people that they had been possessed and that they should now move through to take out anybody that they want to. So this use of the ergot of rye goes back into the ancient past. You can also argue that it was used, or LSD was effectively used, in the Eleusinian mysteries. It was either that or psilocybin, but that's a whole nother topic. So he discovers it in 1938, discovers. Apparently, this was done to help stimulate uterine contractions. It would come later that it would be put to human tests. In 1953, Aldous Huxley, right, big name here, was given a gram of mescaline. And under the direct supervision of the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, he would be the one making Aldous Huxley a kind of human guinea pig, a willing and eager guinea pig, as this quoted. And Osmond would be the one to create the word psychedelic. And this was this meant, or the etymology of this means, mind manifesting, something that manifests the mind, psychedelic. His research would ultimately be tampered out, right? It would be halted in the 1960s because of social and political reasons. The history of the states and prohibition and trying to control the experimentation of the people, not just the states, but all around the world. This is a whole nother topic, not getting into that. But by the end of the 1960s, 2,000 patients had been treated with this, and it continued in Saskatchewan, where they found that 40 to 45% of patients that had been given the drug did not relapse in alcoholism after a year. So they were finding this early on, like they are now, they're bringing this topic back up again, that psychedelics have a therapeutic medicinal effect on people's psychology. So, what is not talked about a lot is in the 1950s and the early 60s, LSD was viewed very positively by the common culture. At worst, it was viewed as a clinical thing, and it was a neutral idea. So this is where we got a lot of those studies that would subsequently be suppressed in time and that are only now coming back up, that it effectively treats alcoholism, autism, depression, and criminal tendencies, allegedly. In 1954, this is the reintroduction of mescaline as the psychiatrist's tool. This was kind of being shown in the media quite a bit, and also of people going to the tribes of Mexico seeking the magic mushroom. And this is when what has been held by the shamans and animistic tribes is finally being revealed to the Western world, as it had been coddled by not only its own isolationist tendencies. Mind you, this is when globalism's really coming up, so this plays its part in this story, but also that it had been coddled by the ways of thinking of the church, right? And who by their right mind would ever participate in ceremonies if you are a missionary. So this is where we get the introduction of the psilocybin mushroom into the common culture. It's around 1957. Likewise, ecstasy, or MDMA, was discovered in 1912. So again, this is all really, when it comes to the stuff that's made, it happened earlier and then it's brought back up later. This was actually, people say that it was made to control appetite, but actually it was made to control bleeding, mistakenly. There are no official tests on or trials on humans, because there's a belief that they have been suppressed between the time of 1912 and the late 70s. But there's a claim from one of these scientists, these early chemists, that this guy, Wolfgang Fürsthofer, might have carried on the first tests on humans in 1959, so just before the 60s, and that these secret trials would eventually bleed the drug out onto the masses, onto the streets. However, you can also claim that the military was already testing MDMA, because they dug it up, and LSD and all this stuff, to try to attempt to find a truth serum or to try to attempt to find ways of creating new chemical weapons. So a lot of the research into MDMA is actually pretty shady and pretty shifty. It's hard to get concrete answers on this, but all of these drugs, MDMA, LSD, the resurgence of psilocybin and plant medicines and ayahuasca and mescaline, this all is kind of bringing itself up from the ground around the same time. MDMA wouldn't fall out of favor until the 90s, really. There was a small group of psychiatrists in the late 70s and early 80s that were still trying to test this for use. But of course, you know how it fell out of favor. So all of the psychedelics being brought back up would be kind of heralded and pioneered by Timothy Leary and subsequently Terence McKenna, and Alan Watts would also play into this conversation. There were many talking points to this conversation because, again, the whole theme here is that the boundaries of how we conceive reality have been dissolving, and psychedelics do that to an exponential degree. So it's no accident that while the boundaries are dissolving in the collective consciousness, that the psychedelics would present themselves to kind of further that agenda, or not present themselves, but kind of reappear to the collective. So Alan Watts is a good reference here too, because he kind of transitions into that bringing the Eastern philosophy into the West. He was very crucial, and Carl Jung, mind you, they were very crucial in reacquainting the Western world with the Eastern religions and the Eastern philosophies, in Hinduism and in Buddhism, different forms of shamanism, Shintoism, Taoism, Confucianism, all of these things, especially Zen. Zen was a really big one. We can thank to them in and also to the mentality of the collective psyche, again, looking for new answers as to how to understand reality, how to understand life, how to understand the afterlife, so forth. So all these things are being thrown into the 60s, but it was more of a bubbling. A bubbling had been happening for a while, and the 60s was kind of this volcano eruption or a geyser giving off that really kind of presented a whole new smorgasbord for humanity to work with in the upcoming future. So you can see how it started small, but now it's really by the 60s, everything has really worked itself up to a summit. Now, the last part that I want to touch on before we really start to break things down is that quantum physics has also messed with our collective psyche and messed with or created or participated in this conception of the new age. Okay, one moment, please. Now, if you read into this, quantum physics uses a language of its own. Physicists have a language of their own. This is something that I tried to study extensively in college, but it really boils down to two simple things. The uncertainty principle. A lot of people are familiar with this. It all started with the question, how does one measure the location of an electron around a nucleus if the electron is a wave? Alan Watts talked about this. Is it prickles? Is it goo? Is an electron a point in time, or is it a wave? And so it brings up the question of what are we looking at? And the uncertainty of what we're looking at, which bleeds into the other topic of the observation bias. So it's called the Hawthorne effect, a form of reactivity in which a subject modifies an aspect of their behavior in response to their knowing that they're being studied. This happens on the human level, and they found that it happens on the quantum level. There's also the observation bias or the observer bias, that they are approaching something with a certain mentality, so then they are only taking certain truths out of the equation because of the mentality that they're approaching the phenomena with. This effect even bleeds into computers. It's called the Heisenberg effect in computers, and that a software bug seems to disappear or alter when its behavior is studied. It's kind of ghost in the machine vibes. So this is physics now is participating in the process of messing with people's minds. It got to such a level that now the very act of physics is a philosophical quandary that pushes us to contemplate our own power as observers of reality, that perhaps science has gone about things in a strange way, assuming objectivity, universal truth of the cosmos. However, this would seem to imply that things are much more subjective. Things are much more about how we look at them. That affects things, that affects the world that we participate in. That gives personal agency and empowerment to the individual, which again is what the New Age is all about. So, what exactly is the New Age then? I've talked around this point the whole time. So, I hope it's clear that it's impossible to really make it very descript, to make that very clear. But it's a smorgasbord of beliefs that have come up to make us question what we've been following on autopilot throughout society in the past. So these are specific ideas. They aren't true of everything I've mentioned, but these are themes that we're seeing in the New Age belief. So one theme is pantheism, which is that God is in everything. We say God, and that might seem to be an homage to certain Abrahamic religions. However, this belief is tied to shamanism, that everything is spirit. And so a way of translating that statement is to say everything is God, that everything has its own agency. Here's another one. All things are one. That is a proponent of the New Age. It's called monism, which, or monoism, or yeah, it is monism. But this is the classic advice of the psychedelic state of mind. Everything is one. And this isn't just something that is perpetuated by psychedelics. This is something at the root of esoteric religions. So the two are playing off each other in a way that's undeniable. Another one that is the controversial one, again, not all of these apply to all beliefs, but it's that man is God. So that seems like a heavy-handed kind of statement. But again, if we have an effect on the subjective reality of things by how we approach them, in that way, we have an aspect of creation. This isn't to say that there is no God and that we are it. This is, because that would be the painful narcissism that we've seen in institutionalized religion throughout the past. This is just to a general statement of the New Age that empowers the individual instead of demotes them and makes them subservient to something that is far greater than them. The other statement of the New Age, mind creates reality. Again, psychedelics, quantum physics, everything is spirit, all of this just blending together. And the last one, that one's own experience validates the truth. So subjectivity, personal agency. You don't have to believe in UFOs if you don't experience UFOs. That should not be pushed on you. What you have experienced is valid. That validates your truth. You stick to that. That is why all of these beliefs are very transient, somewhat elusive, but that is why it's not a church per se. It's not trying to control per se. It is like the Gnostics in that way, that everybody has their own path. So the criticisms of Christianity in this is that certain gurus would make the statement that God would never impose a boundary between us and the enlightenment of the universe. It wouldn't be just for some. It would be for all. New Agers generally, as a general belief, do not believe in evil. That evil is simply a neglect of the truth. That all the things that are wrong are a result of us not seeking higher consciousness. And here's where we get the woke from, you know, if you're woke or not. You know, ways of seeking that wokeness or that higher vibration or that higher consciousness bleeds into all sorts of different beliefs. You have, you know, you could channel, you could have spirit guides, you can do yoga, you can do certain ancient diets, you can use crystals, you can do breathing exercises or meditation. We're blending the Eastern, the shamanistic, the old wives' tales, the old nature centricism of paganism, all together in this new age seeking of higher consciousness, of pushing one individually towards a higher maturation. And all of this is done with a certain type of purpose to awaken the God in man. The God in man. I know, might seem heavy-handed, but again, empowerment, personal agency. And in this way, New Agers are universalists. They fault Christianity and institutional religions for being intolerant and for being narrow-minded. Ignorance, basically. Most New Agers believe, they don't discredit Jesus in any way. He is a great spiritual teacher. He is of great importance to how to approach the world. So this isn't exclusionary by any means. So there is also this aspect of a lack of insight into the true nature of God. That God exists in the nature and reality of things, but it is an elusive topic that we cannot hope to fully understand with how we are approaching reality in the present. This is much like how the Greeks thought, actually. They had their pagan deities and they had a conception of something beyond the pagan deities and a kind of ultra god, an ultra creator, but they believed that it wasn't worth talking about because we had no means of talking about such a topic, and to attempt to talk about such a topic would be a kind of categorical sin, because you would be utterly naive to such things. So in this way, it kind of shares this mentality with the New Age, that it's something much beyond, and it's something that we aspire towards, but it's not something that we can hope to define, categorize, and personify and anthropomorphize as it's been done by institutionalized religion. And the two big ones here, the last kind of themes that I want to go over before I do some closing statements, is there are two centralized focuses. This is on evolutionary godhood, or of all of us becoming greater, becoming more altruistic, becoming more understanding, being enlightened, or reaching the gnosis, and global unity. This is the big one, right? Because this could be a very contentious topic if you bring up the terminology of this as the New World Order, right? That's a whole different subject. But this idea of global unity, that is the collective humanism, the collective humanistic treatment of all people, that all people are worthy, that all people deserve essentials, and that this fighting of hierarchies of the rich having so much and the poor being just boot heeled is unacceptable, and that all humans need to unify and awaken. These are the two tenets of New Age. And see, why is this so contentious to Christianity, right? I mean, I've kind of elaborated on that before, but the very principles of it, for them to claim this is demonic almost makes a demon out of themselves. So, as a quick review, you have practices that include astral projection. You have practices that include channeling spirits. These are the wooey ends of things. You have practices with crystal usage. You have practices with visualization techniques that go all the way from hypnagogic states to mental imagery to speaking with totems or divine creatures. These are the kind of woo-y aspects that make it generally looked at as questionable, not to mention ufology generally being a pseudoscience, and the common culture is to wave that off immediately, right? So this has translated out into a few ways. I've brought up the more sensational and exotic beliefs of this: Theosophy, spiritualism. However, there are much more generalized ways that this new age has brought itself on. And that is Baha'i as a great example. This technically started in 1863, so it goes all the way back to where we started this talk. And it's that all of these different teachers through time, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, are different manifestations of God to push humanity towards a unification of all people, to reject all notions of racism and nationalism, to unify the world order, right? That's Baha'i, not something I've mentioned before, but something I would like to bring up in a talk of itself. And then likewise, why I'm even doing this talk, you know, I am being funded by Unitarian Universalism, which in the same way is a kind of extension of this New Age movement that is not to that contentious degree. It's just a belief that asserts no creed. It's a belief that allows for the shared search of any variety of spiritual growth. So it might include Taoism, it might include Baha'i, it might include Neopaganism, it might include Neognosticism, it might include Christianity, it might include Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, agnosticism, atheism, pantheism. I mean, take your pick, but just the belief that everybody is entitled to their own personal growth spiritually and nothing more. No dogma. This was there's a few dates to talk about here, but the Universalist Church is the main kind of forming body of this. And that's just to say that the Universalists believe that everybody deserves salvation. That was the first step. And this was done all the way back in 1793. So this one has been cooking for a long time. The Unitarian Association came up in 1825, so that's the era that we've been loosely talking about. But then the conjoinment of these two happened in 1961, right? No coincidence there. So there are many ways that we can understand the New Age from this perspective. Baha'i, Unitarian Universalism, these are instances of the lack of any exclusiveness, to be all inclusive, to include all things in the conversation, to not say that these people are better than these people, or these people deserve it and these people don't. And you can see how this translates to other beliefs that might seem the more radical part of the New Age, how it translates to Neo-Gnosticism, how it translates to Theosophy, how it translates to Neopaganism. So, as a kind of wrap-up, all the different characteristics of the New Age are coming from all around the world, are coming from all different times, and that this alleged New Age is specifically a reference to the age of Aquarius, which I've mentioned isn't quite here yet, but we are closer to it than anything else. I think the year is 2150 is the official date by the old great year calendars, but that we are seeing this dissolve because of this New Age. We are changing the way we interpret the world because of this New Age, and that the New Age of itself is conditioning our minds, or deconditioning our minds, so that we can approach reality, life as a human being, life in society, all of these things differently, to dissolve the boundaries of what we have assumed truth to be and what we've assumed our cultural mechanisms need to look like. And so when we see the issues of the modern day, the coming up of the civil rights movements in the 60s and now, the questioning of different governmental ideologies, the dissolve of institutionalized religions and the improvement of different spiritual communities happening all around. All of this is spelling out this kind of formulaic move into the future. And what that looks like is that the old ways of thinking are dying, and they don't want to give up. They will not give up easily. So we're going to see the last fighting gasps of any means necessary to try to maintain that old age. But we are being presented with all of the themes that will be very relevant and imperative to humanity moving forward. And so in a way, this is a very hopeful move. And it's no surprise to see how Christianity reacts to the New Age and why there's such contention, because this is the battle per se. And the only thing further that I want to say about it is that the world is pushing for us throughout the last century, and especially now, and especially into the future. It is constantly pushing for us to have the courage and the audacity to approach things differently, to think about things differently, and to be open, and to not say that you know with a capital K, but to, and this isn't to say to be completely floppy, but this is just to say that we need to allow for ourselves to say that we were wrong, to recognize how we've been conditioned by history and by previous cultural mechanisms, and to take on this new mentality for the hope of a better humanity. We all want a utopic world. We all want one where there's no war, where there's no subservience, and this is possible. And this system is not a fluke. It's not an accident. It's been made to serve the interests of very few at the cost of the many. And the New Age stands to threaten that age-old mechanism, that master-slave mechanism that humanity has been dealing with since the dawn of society. So this is not a small deal. This is a tremendous deal. So we should pay attention. There are many ways to go about dealing with this. Some of us are fighters, and some of us are teachers. But with all of that said, I hope that elaborates a lot more, gives a lot more nuance to what the New Age is and how we can move forward with it. Okay.